Hello, and welcome to a chilly episode of Zilog and Moto. I'm your host Dave, and I don't know about you out there, but it has finally gotten cold here in the west burbs of Chicago. Probably not really cold by our standards yet, but when the temperature drops 30 degrees in one day, you know the holidays are coming soon. But we're not here to talk about the weather, are we? Are we? Because if so, I'm doing this channel way wrong. Seriously though, if this is your first time here to Zilog and Moto, welcome, and I hope you'll come back for many more visits as I go through this giant, well, maybe not giant, I've seen what some of you guys and girls have out there in your collections, but certainly above average sized collection of Sega games behind me. The goal for this channel is to collect and review complete copies of every game released for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega CD, and 32X in the English language, which will include European and Brazilian releases as well. And just to note, before anyone jumps on me in the comments about it, for my purposes, I'm defining a complete copy as one that includes the original box, manual, and cartridge, and anything included that was integral to play the game, so maybe like a map or something like that. I'm not trying to track down every warranty card that might be floating around out there, if you get my drift. All told, that's going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,275 games or so, depending on how many new releases I decide to include in the list. And as you can see from the title of this episode, I've done 176 of these now, so still roughly 1,100 to go. I'm going to be here for a while. But enough about all that. Let's start talking about the reason why you're probably here, and that's the game of the week. OutRun, specifically the version for the Master System. If you know anything at all about Sega, you surely know OutRun, as it was one of the most popular arcade games of the mid to late 80s, debuting in 1986 and getting 4 different cabinet releases, 2 of the sit-down variety, and 2 upright. Due to all these different types of cabinets Sega made OutRun available in, it was perfect for not just the hardcore arcade operator, but also the occasional pizza joint or quickie mart that had less space available for arcade machines and that didn't necessarily want to invest a ton of money into an arcade machine. But not only did Sega make owning an OutRun cabinet convenient for arcade operators and other venues, it was a great game, and chances are players were going to want to play it no matter what the configuration. But I've got to say, if you ever have the opportunity to play one of the deluxe models with the moving seat and the larger monitor, drop what you're doing and go ahead and check that off the bucket list. There's not that many of them out there that are still actually functional, and it's the best possible way to play the game. However, what if it was 1987 and you didn't have access to any of those 4 versions of the arcade machine, but you still needed to get your unlicensed Ferrari fix? Well, that's where today's game comes in, with OutRun for the Master System, which debuted in October of 1987, just in time for Christmas. Was Sega able to deliver super scaling action to the little 8-bit console that could? Or should this have been held off for the more powerful Mega Drive, which was just a year away in Japan? We shall see, but first a look at the package.
And this is OutRun for the Master System. Specifically, this is the original North American version because, surprise, surprise, OutRun actually sold pretty decently in the United States, and it's one of the more commonly available non-sports genre Master System titles, currently going for about $20 complete on price charting. Also, just to be clear, I said this is the original North American version. There's also a re-release out there for it, with the updated formatting on the front and back of the case, and the curious blue label on the cartridge instead of red. It's easy to notice if you happen to have one of those, as the title font was changed to bold black, and the 2 mega cartridge label was removed. These re-release copies are somewhat sought after by Master System collectors, as they're rare even by Master System standards, so if you happen to see one out there and the vendor doesn't realize what they have, grab it and you can thank me later. Original release or no, this particular copy is in pretty decent shape. The outer covers held up well with only a few minor scratches that I could see, but the hang tab was removed somewhat roughly. I should probably clean that up. The outer cover has done its job, and the inner cover looks fantastic with no sun or water damage, or edge wear at the top and bottom. It looks more or less exactly what it would look like on a store shelf 35 years ago, so I'm happy with that. As far as the cover art goes, being that it came out in 1987, it's got one of those covers with the very simplified artwork, with just a super deformed looking version of the Ferrari and a cloud of dust underneath a silhouette of a palm tree. I complain about this art style a lot, and I think it really ruined a lot of covers for the early releases, but I've got to say, in OutRun's defense, this is probably one of the best executions of this style. I don't hate it, and I like how they added in a red scarf from the driver. That's a nice, unexpected detail. Of course, the cover art isn't anywhere near as good as the Japanese version. I mean, come on, how can you look at these two covers and think the non-Mark III art is anywhere even close to the original? So, as usual, I'm maintaining that Sega screwed this up massively, but at least I don't hate the US artwork, as I know it could have been worse. I almost feel bad for making fun of pro wrestling so much. Almost. Flipping over the back, we've got a pretty standard early Master System format with 2 screenshots at the top and then flavor text at the bottom. Sega was smart enough to choose screenshots from 2 different stages, and they look fantastic. The flavor text at the bottom does a good job of selling the game, with a heavy emphasis on nerve, skill, and brains, apparently. But I've got to laugh at seeing OutRun described as the most realistic racing experience. I know what they were going for, but millions of players weren't hitting up the arcade machine because it's realistic. One other note, the box makes reference to 270 kilometers per hour, which does line up with the arcade version, but is odd to see in the United States, and it was even more so back in 1987. Opening up the case, and the cartridge and manual are in decent shape, but the manual has seen a bit of use with some curl to the spine. The manual is relatively thin, with only 12 pages, but that's simply due to there not being that much to explain about OutRun, as this is just a straight port of the arcade version. I would have liked to have seen the course tree explained a bit better, so you'd know where certain locations are, but other than that, it's a solid manual with the traditional high score table at the end. Okay, that's the package for OutRun. Let's get to the game and see what Sega was able to squeeze out of the Master System. OutRun as a series had a few different appearances on the Master System, with the original game that we're talking about this week, which was then followed up by 3 other titles: OutRun 3D, Battle OutRun, and OutRun Europa. Of course, you would never know any of that if you lived in the United States, as only the original game was released in the US, with the closest the other 3 came to coming out being OutRun Europa getting a Game Gear release. I'll cover those other 3 titles later on in some fashion. I still haven't figured out what I'm going to do about the 3D titles, but for today, we're talking about Sega's OG home console version of the arcade classic. OutRun for the Master System was a very important release for Sega, as they wanted to capitalize on the success of OutRun in the arcades, which, as mentioned on the rear cover of the game, was created and made available exclusively by Sega. And that statement was technically true at the time, if you lived in the United States. Eventually, OutRun would see ports to the 8 and 16-bit computers of the day, with releases on the Amstrad CPC, ZX Spectrum, MSX, Commodore 64, Amiga, Atari ST, and DOS. But for 1987 and most of 1988, if you wanted to play OutRun at home, the Master System was your only option. Due to that, OutRun was a critical title for Sega in the Master System catalog, and that was definitely a game that Sega looked to try and sell the console. To that point, the first time that I played OutRun on a console, it was on a Genesis, but it wasn't the Genesis version, it was the Master System version, as I was playing it at a friend's house who owned the power-based converter. Sega ran a deal early on in the Genesis lifespan that if you bought a Genesis and sent in your proof of purchase and $50, you could choose either between 2 Genesis games or a power-based converter and a Master System game. Or something to that effect. I don't remember the exact details, it's been a little while. Anyway, the point is even if you had a Genesis at the time, if you wanted to play OutRun, you were probably playing this 8-bit version. I'd always wondered why, with as popular as OutRun was, how it wasn't one of the launch titles for the Genesis, and instead didn't come out until mid-1991. But now thinking about it, it makes perfect sense. Sega felt like they could sell the Genesis on the backs of other games, and there wasn't a need to make OutRun available on the Genesis until the Master System was dead in the water in North America and Japan. So, enough background, let's discuss OutRun itself. If you've never played OutRun in any flavor, well, first off, I'm somehow surprised how that's possible, but I suppose I could see younger viewers never experiencing it. Regardless, the game is simple. You're racing a red Ferrari, or at least red sports car that looks like a Ferrari depending on the status of Sega's license agreement at the time, and your goal is to make it through 5 stages before time runs out, with the start of each new stage awarding you more time on the clock to help you make it to your goal. In your way are other drivers, and depending on the course, very curvy and undulating tracks that require you to watch your speed, or else risk wrecking and losing valuable time. That might be the difference between making it to the next stage or failure. I mentioned depending on the track in the previous paragraph because OutRun introduced an interesting wrinkle to gameplay, and that's the creation of a multi-tiered pyramid course. While you always start out playing OutRun in the same first stage, after that, you always have a choice when going to new stages, as you can either steer to the left or right. This branching path setup results in 15 possible stages to play, and 5 different endings depending on which path you've picked. The various stages don't just have differing appearances, but they also have different turn layouts, with stages to the left of the pyramid tending to be easier, while right turn options are often, but not always, more difficult. This course layout and freedom of choice gives the game an unexpected bit of replayability, as not only do you have 5 different endings to try to get, but depending on the ending you choose, you might have multiple different paths to get there, making OutRun a unique experience. But that's all just referring to the game in general, and the arcade experience. What about the Master System version? Was Sega able to bring that same experience home? For all intents and purposes, yes. What's presented in-game reflects the arcade machine, with the obvious cuts needed in graphics and sound to make the game work on an 8-bit console that was far, far removed from the powerful arcade hardware of Sega's Super Scalar series of arcade boards. Sega managed to squeeze the full arcade game into 2 megabits, with all 15 courses available to race on, and A, B, C, D, and E endings present, if you're good enough to get there. However, don't expect anything else besides the arcade game, as the game has no options to speak of. There are apparently cheat codes available if you want to get a music test, and to start the game with less time on the clock if you want an additional challenge, but I would hardly call this any kind of bonus content. In looking at OutRun, it should come as no surprise that the game looks like an 8-bit title, especially with it releasing in mid to late 1987, which is pretty early by Master System standards, and as such, didn't benefit from programmers having years of experience on the console. However, it doesn't look bad at all, just simpler. All of the sprites in the game are smaller than their arcade counterparts, as you would expect, and of course have less detail. This goes not just for the cars on the track, but the potential obstacles on the side of the road and the turn signs. But homages to the original arcade art are clear, and the various stages accurately reflect how they were supposed to look. For instance, the sand-swept desert track in Stage 3, where the track is hard to see due to all the dust. Sega even included the course that I had all but assumed would at least be heavily modified, if not completely removed, Gateway, which is the one where you are apparently driving underneath some sort of elevated pathway or bridge. On the back of the package, I made fun earlier of Sega calling OutRun on the Master System the most realistic racing experience, because clearly this is an arcade game and not some sort of sim like Gran Turismo or Forza. However, I don't think implying the game was actually realistic is what Sega was going for here. One of the things that the arcade version was known for was its somewhat unique sense of speed, which did lead to the game feeling realistic in a sense. This was achieved by the scaling of the sprites along with some nice animations here and there. The Master System version still has some of that same feel, as the game engine runs at a decent speed, and certainly going slower in the car feels much different than when you have the throttle wide open. This was achieved by, as I mentioned, vastly simplifying the game, by having less opponents on the road and less background elements on the side of the road. And while sure, the graphic downgrades are very noticeable, the fact that it still plays like the arcade game, while at least bearing a passing resemblance to it, shouldn't be slept on. Also, if I can say this in the Master System's favor, compare what the Master System version looks like to those other 8-bit ports I mentioned earlier. The Amstrad CPC version has a decent looking Ferrari, but absolutely crawls and has no music. The ZX Spectrum version is an absolute horror show. And I probably go back and forth between the Commodore 64 and MSX versions as to which one is better, but both absolutely pale in comparison to the Master System. Even the DOS, Amiga, and Atari ST versions, while all having more detail than the Master System version, don't quite measure up, as none of them have that same sense of speed, which truly wouldn't be equaled until the PC Engine version arrived on the scene over 3 years later in late 1990. One of the things OutRun was known for in the arcades was having the ability to choose what your background music was before you started your attempt to make it to the finish line. This is done via a radio interface where you can turn the dial to the song that you want, with the tracks Passing Breeze, Splash Wave, and my favorite, Magical Sound Shower, all being available choices. The Master System version includes all three of these tracks, and they're okay. The default PSG-based sound chip in the Master System is a bit limited on synths, but they all at least resemble the original compositions. Also, even though the Japanese cover doesn't advertise it, there is a FM soundtrack available if you have the ability to play it back, but honestly, I wouldn't bother, as it sounds very tinny compared to the PSG version, and the sound effects in the FM version are absolute horrid. It's probably for the best that Sega didn't advertise it being present. The best thing I can say about the Master System version of OutRun is, despite any graphical or audio shortcomings, the game feels like OutRun. The controls are dead on, with gas, brake, shifting gears, and steering all being very responsive. The game isn't cheap at all, with possibly the most annoying thing being speeding over a hill and not seeing another car until you're right on top of it. But that's directly from the arcade game and a danger of real-life driving. Your success or failure at OutRun will simply come down to practice and learning where the gotchas are in the various courses. And that's exactly how a racing game should be. As a result, I'm giving OutRun for the Master System 3 stars. It's a solid port of the arcade game on much less powerful hardware, but at the same time, that's also all it is, so anyone hoping for some bonus home version features will have to do without.
Okay, that was OutRun for the Master System. OutRun is one of those games that you can occasionally pop in for 30 minutes, an hour, and it's always fun. It's not a game that most people are just going to spend hours upon hours on, as it simply doesn't have that kind of depth, but the fact that the game still holds up 35 years later just speaks to how great a concept it was, and how well Yu Suzuki and his teammates did at bringing the game to life. If you're a Master System fan, I think this is one that has to be in your collection. Next week on Zilog and Moto, I play a game for the Genesis that I weirdly thought that I had reviewed already, but now thinking back on it, that was just me playing it a lot when I first added it to the collection. The reason for that is because even though the game seems a bit crude now, when I first found and played it in the arcades, I absolutely loved it. And I certainly wasn't the only person to feel that way, as it ended up serving as the inspiration for one of the greatest arcade series of all time. This original game wasn't on fire necessarily, but it certainly knew how to knock out the competition. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 176. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you are so inclined, as it will help people see these videos, but most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later.